Iridion 3D, released in 2001 as one of the launch titles for the Game Boy Advance courtesy of Majesco and Shi-In Multimedia, is a third-person rail shooter similar in vein to games like Galaxy Force or Space Harrier. I've heard one person compare this to Star Fox, which isn't entirely accurate, but I can understand the comparison. You do control a starfighter of sorts and you either blast or fly your way past 7 stages of various enemy waves and hazards before eventually facing off against the end boss of each stage. Once you complete a stage, you'll earn a password that will allow you to resume your progress at a later time. In regards to the core gameplay, Iridion 3D is very simple to grasp, right down to control, which comprises the D-pad to move your ship, the A button to shoot your guns, and the start button to start, pause, or unpause your game. And that's it. To the game's credit, it controls fairly well, responsive for the most part, though your ship's movement does feel a bit floaty at times, making it somewhat hard to control precisely, but other than that, it's not too bad. And you can even hold down the A button for rapid fire action, which is nice. So as stated, your main goal in Iridion 3D's 7 stages is to survive various waves of enemy ships, debris, or other hazards while admiring the wonderful graphical effects in the pseudo 3D backgrounds until you reach the end of the level where you fight the boss. Along the way, you'll come across various colored capsules that will give you different weapons, and collecting multiple capsules of the same color will eventually upgrade said weapon. There's also a flashing capsule that you can collect that will restore your shield energy. Yes, Iridion 3D has a health meter for your fighter, in which you take multiple hits from enemy projectiles and fewer hits from multiple head-on collisions. When the shield's gone, your ship is lost and you lose a life. Once all your lives are lost, it's game over. Naturally, the main appeal of Iridion 3D is the graphical aspect of the game, and the graphics are very nice for a 2001 launch title. The scaling and frame rate overall is pretty smooth. It doesn't look weird or awkward. I mean, yeah, the first stage where you're escaping a garbage chute pretty much isn't exactly the most endearing first impression. With that Death Star core looking boss, especially the way the whole room spins in a 360 fashion, that looks pretty cool. Not to mention the cloud effects and the space tube looking thing in the later levels. I give Iridion credit. These are some fine pseudo 3D terrain you'll be flying through, and it's kind of them to make it so that I could hug the side of the screen without fear of taking damage or crashing or anything of the sort like some other rail shooters that I've played. I appreciate that piece of business. Now, there is the caveat, as with any game of this ilk, where your ship, if it's hovering right in the middle, it'll block your view of what's right in the center of the screen, which is a bit of an inconvenience when you're fighting a boss and their weak point just happens to be smack dab in the middle of the screen. There's no first-person cockpit view to switch to. Everything is done from this third-person behind-the-back view, and look, central blind spot half the time aside, Iridion 3D looks pretty damn sweet and does the third-person pseudo 3D presentation far better than some other pile of licensed crap that I played that will be released a couple years later, and boy, I feel that deserves a revisit one of these days. So naturally, there's always that little thing where, with these launch games of technical prowess, where you can admire the game's presentation and such, but eventually you do have to sit down and play the game. And this is where these sorts of tech demos disguised as video games usually start to fall apart. In the case of Iridion 3D, I think the only aspect that falls apart is when you realize the gameplay underneath the splendor is rather basic and unimpressive. Now, some would see that as a flaw, but sometimes it's okay to have simple mechanics behind the jazz, so long as those mechanics work the way they're supposed to, and fortunately here they do, most of the time at least. What you've got here is a fairly simplistic, straightforward, on-rails, third-person space shooter game that doesn't do a whole lot gameplay-wise. Again, D-pad and one button is all you're really using here, but what it does relatively well. Now again, a couple caveats that might impede some enjoyment. We've mentioned central positioning being a blind spot of sorts that time when it comes to fighting anything directly in front of you, but there's also a tendency to sometimes lose track of perspective and perception, so sometimes lining up your shots while dealing with the background gruff can be a bit disorienting. And there are some occasional, yet still fairly infrequent bouts of slowdown that will pop up every so often, though not all that often. Other than that, however, the gameplay is pretty solid. You have different weapons that can be upgraded a few times, and unlike most shooters, dying doesn't reset you back to basics, but it does reduce your current weapons level by 1, unless you're already at the lowest level. And the weapons themselves aren't too bad, some of them are fun to use. And while the game does occasionally have bits of slowdown here and there, it doesn't really kill the game entirely, and the overall speed's generally consistent. Considering the hardware this was released on and the timing in general, Iridion 3D turned out better than I was expecting, given some of the more lukewarm reactions I've come across regarding this title. I am a bit miffed by the lack of continues, however. There's a password system, sure, but are you really going to have pen and paper on you at all times so you could jot down the password if you happen to clear the level? And to do that all the time, isn't that... Anyways, I don't know. Whatever. Oh, did I mention the soundtrack on this thing? No? Iridion 3D's got a killer soundtrack, everybody. Some quality chiptunes on this here Game Boy Advance handheld video game system thing. To be honest, I'm actually quite impressed by the quality of some of these tunes in general because these almost sound too good for Game Boy Advance. I'll leave that up to you to decide whether that's a good thing or not, but yeah. Killer soundtrack, some good tunes on there, not so killer sound effects. They're fine really, nothing really special, they're just sort of there. Good tunes. You could check out in the sound test and turn off if you wanted to. Overall, Iridion 3D was a pretty good effort for a GBA launch title. As a shooter game, really nothing special. Short, simple, somewhat bare bones. A couple of quirks that might keep some folks from getting into this one. But on the other hand, fun little game, challenging at times. And if you want a good showcase of what the Game Boy Advance was capable of in regards to pseudo 3D gameplay, or you just want a tech demo type game that doubles as a good playable game for once, then Iridion 3D is worth checking out. I had fun with this one. I like this one. Better than whatever the fuck this was.